Let's just take a look at these real quick. Of course, again, this is Departure. And the two albums that came before this that he's calling part of this trilogy are, of course, the album right there, Infinity, and then the album Evolution. So Infinity came out in 78, Evolution came out in 79, and then Departure came out in 80. Now, something kind of, I love these album covers, by the way. I think they're so amazing. But something that's kind of interesting about this when you look at the color scheme is that here we have Infinity, and it kind of has the yellows and reds into the purples. And on Evolution, we have more of the greens and blues. And then when you get to Departure, all of them are together. And I think it's just kind of neat that it kind of culminated in this album, Departure, just the color schemes, the way they did. I don't know if it was planned or not, but I think these are just amazing album covers, the way they do the feathers. And then we get introduced to the scarab. Of course, in each one of these albums, they have these, these little infinity symbols that go along with it. And it's also interesting when you look on the inside of this album, they have the 1980 and just kind of go along with the infinity thing. They take the 8 and they flip it sideways. So when they talk about the last album in a trilogy, I think of other albums as the trilogy. And let me explain. And if you're a Journey fan, you'll know what I'm talking about here. Because the real trilogy, in my mind, started at this point. Because you had the album Departure, and then, which led to the album Captured, and then what happens after you're captured? You escape. So to me, this was more of the trilogy than the other three. But either way, the other thing that ties these things together is the artwork. And when you go back to this very first one, these albums were all designed by Alton, Kelley, and Stanley Mouse. And you look right here on the cover, and this one actually says right there, Kelley Mouse. And that's the two people that they're talking about. And every one of these covers from Infinity all the way through Escape were either designed by both of these two or one or the other. And by the way, this art team of Alton, Kelley, and Stanley Mouse were well known in the area of San Francisco for their early work with the Grateful Dead. If you go to Evolution, you'll see again right there, it says Kelley Mouse. If you go to Departure, which of course is the one after that, down here it just says Kelley. When you get to Captured, there it just says Mouse. And then you get to Escape, and once again, it just says Mouse right there. And so all of these albums were designed by, again, one or both. And then when they get to Frontiers, everything changed, and then they move off to, it was kind of interesting because the entire theme, they'd had these feathers, and then they kind of evolved into this scarab, and they had this way of doing things, and then all of a sudden they get to Frontiers and everything changes. You could feel the evolution, if you will, of Journey, and probably some of the influence of Steve Perry. And maybe that gets back to a little bit of the quote that we were reading that we mentioned a little bit earlier. Schon feels that with Departure, Journey has moved into new areas and has broadened their musical base, but not to the extent he'd like. Quote, "We want to go to extremes, but I think we've got a really heavy start here," he said. "I feel that the new material is more energized. We played live. There are practically no guitar overdubs. When we recorded the single, Any Way You Want It, we just went in there and cut it live. And I think that's why a lot of people think it sounds, now listen to this, think it sounds new wave. Because new wave bands walk into the studio and play live. They cut an album in 20 hours and that's it." Now, this is, to me, this is just so absolutely fascinating listening to these descriptions like this, especially when we start when we have these terms. Because we've talked about this on this channel a bunch, the term heavy metal, and how that got applied to so many different things. And now listening to Neal Schon, again, this is back in 1980. You have to consider the context when we read these things of the world that they were in at that point, 1980. And when they're talking about new wave at this point, what they're likely referring to is what had happened just a few years earlier that had kind of really caught on, which was the punk movement. And a lot of people back at that time were calling that new wave. It was the new wave of music. And that term had been used loosely in different things, kind of like heavy metal did. And that's really what he's talking about here. These bands who would go into the studio, they'd knock these things out really quickly. And Journey's saying, hey, we even went into the studio, we played Any Way You Want It almost completely live, just like the new wave bands do. And by the way, is there Is there a more awesome song than Any Way You Want It? I have a soft spot in my heart for Journey, just in general, because my very first concert was Journey. I saw them on the Escape tour. My father took me to see them. I don't remember specifics. I just remember loving it. But I think this was probably the second album that I got. I think Escape was the first one, and then I got this, and I remember I played this thing over and over and over. I just loved everything about it. And, when it starts out with that, that incredible song, Any Way You Want It, that hit and the harmonies, and she loves to laugh, she loves to sing. I'm like, it's such a great tune. And this whole album, the entire thing just has so many great songs. And to me, this was really Journey at their peak, especially during the Greg Raleigh area. There was just so much great stuff on here. Anyway, let's just jump back into the article. But Journey hasn't joined the New Wave parade, Schon added. We're not trend followers. 11 years ago, when I was growing up and very into The Who, they were New Wave. So I know what the original New Wave is all about, and what people are calling New Wave today, to me, is Old Wave. Don't you just love this? This is one of the reasons I love doing this channel, is going back and looking at this stuff and listening to the way people were talking and the references, and it just, the culture at the time was just a little different. And the way they'd express themselves. Speaking of the word evolution, this is still early on in the evolution of modern music. I mean, so many things were changing. So many things were happening. You just came out of the 70s. You are now at the beginning of 1980. They're departing into, and it even says that, interestingly, on the inside of this album, join us for our departure into the 80s. They were launching now into the 1980s, and the world was a different place. And then we'd watch all the changes that would happen through the 1980s and then into the 90s. Again, so much was changing. So much great music was happening. So many things were evolving, and going back now and looking at what they're saying, it's so much fun. With the single, or Where Were You, or some of the hard rock stuff, we're getting back to where we started out and keeping the vocals intact. We have a total departure on the second side with songs like Good Morning Girl and Stay a While, where there are no guitar solos. That's really different for us. And I remember listening as a kid to the song Good Morning Girl. I don't know why I liked that song so much, but I loved it. I loved this record. There were so many great things about it. Okay, Departure was recorded in 3 weeks, which is a lot faster than the last one, which took 3 months. Production credit is given to Jeffrey Workman, who engineered their last 2 albums, and their live sound engineer, Kevin Elson, but everyone actually got involved. Quote, Jeff Workman got all the sound on the record, and Kevin Elson helped us with arrangements and gave us general advice, said Neal. But the band did produce this album as well, because we arranged all the songs before we got into the studio. A lot of producers rearrange all your songs, but Journey's not the kind of band that needs that. Now, this is interesting because Jeff Workman, again, you'll see it right here, is the person who produced this album. He really ultimately became kind of a legendary producer. I mean, he worked with bands like Queen, he worked with Dokken, Foreigner, Motley Crue, Twisted Sister, The Cars. I mean, he was all over the place. Now, what's interesting when you think of Jeff Workman in relation to the band Queen, now check this out. These first 2 albums, part of the, once Steve Perry had joined, Infinity was produced by Roy Thomas Baker. Evolution was produced by Roy Thomas Baker. Do you know what Roy Thomas Baker produced? Roy Thomas Baker produced Bohemian Rhapsody. So he'd worked as a producer for Queen. Now, Jeff Workman had worked with Roy Thomas Baker on the Queen album Jazz. And then the following album after this, the following studio album that is, Escape, was produced by a guy named Mike Stone. What album had Mike Stone produced? Mike Stone produced News of the World, which had We Will Rock You and We Are the Champions. So it's just kind of fascinating to me when you go back and look at some of these names and you see these connections, that the guys that had been working with Journey in the early days had these really strong connections working with the band Queen. By doing the album themselves the way they wanted to, the group found out they were right all along about the best techniques to use. Now we're starting to sound more like us rather than having someone make us sound different, said Schon. People can identify with that, especially when they see us live, and the new stuff sounds just like the record.